Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting general session. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen so that if you require technical assistance, you can send a chat to the event producer. Participant audio lines will be muted until the designated Q&A periods of the call. At that time, you may use the raise hand icon located in the top right-hand corner of the chat window to enter the question queue. And just a reminder that this call is being recorded. With that, I'll turn it over to the chair of the Market Surveillance Committee, Dr. Benjamin Hobbs. Please go ahead. And Dr. Hobbs, it appears you are muted.
Okay, how's that?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you, and thanks everybody who's attending the meeting today. We have two substantive agenda items, the day-ahead markets enhancements and resource efficiency evaluation. But before we get into the meat of the agenda, I'd like to first introduce those who are here on behalf of the California ISO. And in the Market Surveillance Committee, we have myself, Dr. James Bushnell, and Dr. Scott Harvey. And then from the ISO, we have James Friedrich, who will be talking about the day-ahead market enhancements. He'll be a first major agenda item. And then Dr. Guillermo Bautista-Alderete, who is going to be in charge of the second agenda item, resource efficiency evaluation. Also on the lines are Danny Johnson, Brad Cooper, Anna McKenna, and Shami Davis. Anybody else from the ISO? I think I got them all. Great. So as usual, I'll preface the meeting in saying this is not a stakeholder process, but we do very much value your comments and inputs and questions. And so for that reason, our first agenda item is public comment, which I would welcome on any issue, although if it's an issue that we're addressing later in this meeting, it'd probably be better to hold the comments until later. So, operator, I'd like to open the phone lines for any comments or questions from the public this time.
No problem, and just a reminder, you can enter the queue by using the raise hand icon located in the top right-hand corner of the chat window. And if you dialed in on the phone-only line, you can press #2 to enter the question queue. And I do not see any comments or questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, thanks for checking. I'm sure we'll hear a lot later on. Okay, so we can then immediately move to James, who's going to be leading a discussion on day-ahead market enhancements, in particular focusing on the question of the rationale for and the benefits of imbalance reserves relative to the way that things are now done day ahead to make sure that there's the extra smidgen of capacity you need to make sure you cover forecast errors and other contingencies. That is a residual unit commitment. So James, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs. Hello, everyone. This is James Friedrich from the California ISO. I'll be leading today's discussion on day-ahead market enhancements. Before I get started with the material, I thought I would let stakeholders know we are planning a stakeholder workshop for the day-ahead market enhancements sometime in December. At that meeting, we'll be picking up where we left off in terms of design specifics, and of course the discussion related to today's MSC item could inform other topics that we discussed at that meeting. The date is to be determined, but just wanted stakeholders to have that workshop on their radars. Let's go to the next slide. So as Ben foreshadowed, the purpose of today's discussion is not necessarily to go into specific day-ahead market enhancement design details, but rather to address some recent stakeholder concerns that the ISO has not done enough to sufficiently justify the need for the imbalance reserve product, nor has it done enough to estimate the market impacts of introducing imbalance reserves. The counterfactual we are comparing against, of course, is the status quo, where system operators are procuring additional supply in RUC beyond the RUC forecast to meet net load uncertainty. The capacity procured from this process incurs relatively little direct market costs because most of the capacity procured in RUC comes from RA resources that do not receive RUC capacity payments. So our goal today is to refresh the discussion on why we think introducing an imbalance reserve product to the integrated forward market is an improvement on the status quo. We're also working on a set of related quantitative analyses to justify the need for imbalance reserves and estimate their impacts. And here on the slide, we've listed 5 such analyses that we're either working on now or planning to work on. First is to estimate what the historical imbalance reserve requirement would have been using the quantile regression methodology described in some of our past papers. This would give stakeholders a sense of the magnitude of procurement of the imbalance reserve product, what to expect, and perhaps give a sense of the trends and seasonality or other patterns. The second analysis is to refresh our past analysis on imbalance trends. We've shown in previous DAME policy papers and other CAISO analyses that the net load imbalances between day-ahead and real-time markets are both large and growing. This is from the increasing uncertainty in system conditions through more variable energy resource output on the system and things like extreme weather conditions making it hard to properly forecast. The increasing net load imbalances and increasing uncertainty between day-ahead and real-time increases the operator's perception of risk and widens their confidence band that they need to feel comfortable that the system in the day-ahead time frame is well set up, which justifies some of the reasons why operators are procuring additional supply in RUC beyond the forecast. So this analysis will show how those trends have persisted or potentially changed using current data. The third analysis is to compare historical RUC adjustments to the estimated imbalance reserve requirement to get a sense of the substitutability between these things and to see if the imbalance reserve requirement is well aligned with the operator's historical risk preference. The fourth analysis is to estimate the incremental cost of imbalance reserves. We haven't solidified the exact details of this analysis yet, but it would look something like rerunning past market results with an increased reserve requirement of some type to see what happens. And then the last analysis, which was suggested by the MSC in our last discussion on day-ahead market enhancements in August, is to see if, to look at the incidence of RUC commitments and schedules across resource types and load-serving entities to see whether RUC burdens fall disproportionately on flexible resources or resources with low commitment costs that are then not compensated with market payments. So our plan is to present the results of these analyses at some future venue, potentially the next DAME stakeholder workshop or maybe at a next or a future market surveillance committee meeting. And we wanted to make stakeholders aware that these analyses are going on to provide some context into when we talk in the future slides about benefits, how some of those analyses may substantiate those benefits or highlight them in a more quantifiable fashion, but also to think about other suggestions potentially about analyses that CAISO could do to further substantiate the benefits of imbalance reserves or estimate their market impact. So before I move on, I'll stop there and see if there's any comments from the MSC before I move into the slides talking about benefits.
All right, and just a reminder for those who've joined in the interim You can enter the queue by using the raise hand icon located in the top right-hand corner of the chat window. And if you called in on the phone-only line, you can press pound 2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue. All right, and I do not yet see any comments in the queue at this time.
Okay, thanks. Just see if Jim Scott, you want to say anything? Scott
isn't going to add anything, not at this time.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Nothing.
Okay, let's get,
Okay,
James, we can continue.
Slide 3. Okay, let's move to slide 3. So the next 3 slides will lay out what we believe to be the various benefits of imbalance reserves. The first 2 slides, slide 3 and 4, relate to benefits specifically in the context of today's IFM. And then the third slide, which is slide 5, will talk about benefits in the context of EDAM. So this first slide will discuss more system level type benefits, the system level type benefits of the imbalance reserves. And let me start by repeating that, you know, we're comparing these benefits against the status quo, that is essentially the system operators procuring additional supply beyond the REC requirements to meet net load uncertainty. So essentially today, operators are procuring capacity that mimics a function of a day-ahead flexible reserve product just through out-of-market actions. And we contend that introducing a flexible reserve product like imbalance reserves into the market software, specifically into IFM, where it can be co-optimized with energy and contingency reserves, would lead to various improvements, one being more optimal unit commitment decisions, and 2, more optimal allocation of system ramping capability. So from an optimization objective cost basis, co-optimizing these flexible reserves in the IFM is a more effective and efficient procurement mechanism than procuring them through RUC adjustments. Second, we contend that imbalance reserves better ensure the system has sufficient ramping capability because first, RUC only really fulfills energy needs. It does not consider the change in energy needs between intervals, whereas IFM would be able to do that. And second, although RUC does provide some flexibility in real time through its real-time software obligations, it's mostly scheduling on already committed units that, you know, are not set up through the IFM today to incorporate the trade-offs between cost and speed of reaching the upward uncertainty requirement. So if you had the IFM setting up the system to meet the upward uncertainty requirement, you would better incorporate the trade-off between cost and flexibility to reach the upward uncertainty requirement. The third bullet contends that scheduling imbalance reserves in IFM better ensure that IFM export schedules are feasible to the extent that the imbalance reserve product reduces the need for operators to procure supply beyond the RUC forecast, which essentially means that the IFM and RUC schedules will be more aligned and thus lowers the probability of export schedules being infeasible in RUC. The last bullet describes the benefits of deliverability in IFM compared to RUC. The deliverability tests in IFM are more sophisticated than RUC, thus they better ensure that the flexible reserves procured are deliverable to where they're needed. So before I go on to the next slide, any comments from the MLC or comments from the public?
Hey, James, just a clarification on that last bullet. Rather than, I would characterize it as the deliverability tests for imbalance reserves in IFM would be is more sophisticated than RUC. Yeah, you know, because RUC today is running the same nodal model that the day-ahead market is running. So, you know, IFM today and RUC assured deliverability the same. The nuance is imbalance reserves is we're modeling their deployment to the deployment scenarios, which spread that energy across, to VER locations and to demand, which is different than IFM's modeling of load and RUC's modeling of load.
Yeah, good point. They would, the deployment scenarios would essentially distribute or allocate the uncertainty into locations where it's more likely to be needed, whereas allocating it just through the RUC load forecast, may not distribute that uncertainty in the same way.
Or it might. This is Scott Harvey. It might choose a higher cost solution because the RUC increasing the load forecast is going to say all of the resources have to be deliverable to load on top of the load forecast, which means it's going to be shifted towards procuring flexibility inside the constrained areas on a more limited set of resources, whereas the way I think PG&E suggested it was to the deliverability test from balance reserves is to partly model it as located at load, but partly model it as located at the location of the variable energy resources. So you're not going to necessarily be procuring more costly resources inside the load centers all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, a potential benefit.
So, James, I don't know if you want
to move to attendee questions. Sorry, go ahead.
This is Ben. Yeah, James, I don't know if you'd like to comment on how the analyses that are underway that you described in the previous page will shed some light on some of these, and which of these may be more difficult to get a quantitative handle on. So, for example, the first one might require modeling and rerunning the market and comparing the costs relative to RUC. That would seem to be more involved, perhaps, than one might want to do. But anyway, do you have any comments on the relationship of the previous slides analyses and each of these?
Yeah. So, and I would like Guillermo expand on my comments if needed. But one of the challenges of measuring some of the benefits on this slide, particularly, is that the counterfactual that we're comparing against is imbalance reserves in our historical market, and we don't have the ability to model, we don't have the software to model the imbalance reserve. So we'd have to come up with some sort of workaround to decide, to determine, what the impacts historically of the imbalance reserve might be, especially relating to, the first bullet there, how unit commitment decisions may change and, how system ramping capability may be better allocated. That being said, there is, potential to do, some thought exercises like we've done in the past, with examples. And I know it's not always easy to come up with perfectly representative examples, but, there may, be, some examples that we could put out that show benefits of these things. And yeah, really, it's tough to proxy to capturing the co-optimization part of imbalance reserves with energy. But I'd like Guillermo expand on that if needed.
So, Guillermo, I'll give you a chance to collect your thoughts on that. Let's see, just going down the other bullets first, I'll make some comments. So the second one, I guess there's a hypothesis here that that rucked capacity might not really have changed the amount of flexibility available to the system if it's imported RA or if it's scheduled and committed units. So that's something that could be looked at, and what fraction of rucked capacity is indeed an increase in flexibility under especially stress conditions, I guess. I don't know whether in the third bullet you can identify how often exports schedules wound up being infeasible due to the ruck schedule, if that's something that could be assessed. The deliverability, yeah, that's without actually having the software include the deliverability test, that's going to be more difficult unless there are obvious cases in the past when ruck capacity was needed because of unexpected ramps, but could not be dispatched, similar to some of the analyses that Guillermo did a couple of years ago on flexible ramp delivery. But at any rate, so historical data will give an idea of the extent that ruck may have been what was scheduled in ruck was inefficient in the past, or may have scheduled or may not have been truly least cost. If we consider the actual costs of committing extra capacity, which IR would use, of course, a bid-based system. So Guillermo, I don't know if you have any comments on the extent to which the analyses could address each of these.
Yes, Ben, thank you. And I will just second what James was indicating, right? I think we're in this exploration phase of trying to put the pieces together of how we can feasibly come with an estimation in some sense of different attributes of the imbalance reserve. As James indicated, one of the limitations is that we don't have a box where we can play with the imbalance reserve formulation to see how that would play out. So we are so far limited to the current construct that we have, the current formulation that we have. So in that sense, I think we have good capabilities to do as much as analytics as needed within the current framework, and we can assess how effectively ROC has been to give us a flexible reserve by means of the ROC adjustments or the incremental from IFM. I think historically we have relied on very targeted cases for stress conditions, and right now we are expecting to analyze this in detail for September 7th, September 8th of 2020, when we have these tight conditions and see. And this is the set of days when we have observed the largest imbalance requirement for the year. So I think these are the default cases to analyze and stress test how it performs and how the flexible reserve could help. The other area that we have been analyzing is the correlation between the ROC adjustments that we currently have in place with the imbalance reserve requirements that we have estimated for a period of time, and see how more efficiently the imbalance reserve can do the job instead of the ROC adjustment. The last piece is about some sensitivity analysis we want to do regarding potential cost. And again, we don't have a formulation right now to estimate the cost of procuring the imbalance reserve, but we want to potentially explore a proxy of using non-spin reserves, a scale value of non-spin reserves to simulate the provision of the imbalance reserve, and just to get some sense of what resources, what flexibility we are getting once we stress the system to give us that extra requirement includes of the imbalance reserve. And I would say part of having this discussion today is to gain feedback, right? I think we are in this exploratory phase, and any feedback would be useful to understand what other elements would be meaningful and feasible to to explore at this stage of the process.
Thanks, Guillermo. I do agree the comparison of the historical RUC adjustments to estimates of the imbalance reserve requirement is definitely going to be quite interesting to see whether operators, for example, are pretty consistent over time in terms of the amount they get and the implied risk that they're willing to tolerate in terms of meeting the net load. And I suppose also such a comparison might reveal whether the RUC adjustments might occur for, I don't know if there would be reasons other than net load uncertainty, whether there are other reasons why they would want to increase the RUC requirements. I suppose those other reasons might simply be just basically the operators could use exceptional dispatch if they needed something in a particular place, or there is a contingency they were concerned about. But we're pretty confident that in general that the RUC adjustments are out of a generalized concern over the risk of not being able to meet the net load, or there are other reasons that sometimes operators make RUC adjustments.
Yeah, that's a very key point, Ben, and I can tell you upfront that based on historical analysis we have done, the RUC adjustments are to cover beyond the net load uncertainty. There are other types of load supply uncertainties that operators sometimes have to factor in when they make the determination of the adjustments, such as this season, for instance, right? We have this fire, this loss of import supply. That is an uncertainty that naturally is not going to be within the scope of the net load uncertainty.
Okay, thank you. I believe we have at least one person in the queue who would like to make a comment or question. Adam?
That's true. Yes. So before we let them do that, I've received a couple chat PMs with questions. Just a reminder to the audience that we don't take questions or comments in the chat. That's just for tech help. And we'll go ahead and unmute the first commenter. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions here. Just thinking through a couple things here and kind of reviewing the slides this morning. Just a question, I guess, up front is the ISO still looking at the reliability capacity concept as well? And if so, would any of this analysis be kind of looking at both of those products? Or are you kind of imbalance reserve on this slide is capturing both of those?
This is James, and yeah, we're still going forward with the reliability capacity concept. The reason why we have omitted reliability capacity from these slides and probably from the analyses is that it's not really functionally different than RUC today, with the exception of the downward capacity. And actually, there's potential that that the downward capacity, the RCD reliability capacity down could do some good. That whose benefits we may be able to quantify to some extent. But yeah, because it's not, the RCU isn't much different than the RUC today, we aren't really focused on that here.
Okay. And then just kind of thinking about the imbalance reserve, I think the last time that the design was discussed, I think it was that it was basically only internal resources that would be able to provide that because of the 15-minute dispatch requirements, or maybe some 15-minute dispatchable intertie resources. And I was the line of thinking that I was led to was around if DAME is now going to be implemented concurrently with EDAM, should that open up a much more broad supply pool for imbalance reserves on the assumption that EDAM would be a 15-minute committed product or 15-minute adjustable. But then on the other hand, if there's nodal deliverability constraints for imbalance reserves that may constrain it back down to internal resources. And I'm just kind of asking whether there's some things you could share around that or some thoughts around that that may play into some of this analysis as far as just sort of, what's the supply pool that is getting optimized here?
Yeah, I'll let others follow on. I'll just generally comment that we do think that there's a big diversity benefit potential for imbalance reserves in EDAM, and that's on our fifth slide. I'll let others follow up on that, but that's just my general reaction from your comment.
And I guess too, before the follow-up, are you still thinking about allowing VERS to provide imbalance reserves too? I can't remember where that landed in the last proposal.
Yeah, that's so in reaction to some stakeholder comments in the last proposal who were concerned about the ability for variable energy resources to provide imbalance reserves. We're looking into that some more, and are trying to work with variable energy resource providers who say it's important for them to be able to provide the product, have the flexibility to provide the product, and are able to provide the product, against the view that, the reliability of relying on variable energy resource providers to, provide that may cause some uncertainty that inherently the product is attempting to address. So we're trying to balance those views out and haven't really landed on a fixed spot yet.
Okay, thanks, James. Thanks, Dan.
Was Brad responding to something there too, or I didn't?
Oh, yeah, I guess I could add on. Yeah, Dan, you're right. And we'll get to this. We have a slide coming up. Imbalance reserves, we think will be an important component of EDAM because it will allow the optimization of this additional capacity across the EDAM footprint, as opposed to, for instance, if under an EDAM construct, we were continuing to get this capacity through RUC adjustments that we could get through imbalance reserves, then obviously then we wouldn't be taking advantage of the diversity of capacity and the availability of capacity across the EDAM footprint to rely on that capacity to meet net load uncertainty. So yes, we view imbalance reserves as being an important component of the EDAM because it allows for the optimization of this, spare capacity to respond to uncertainty in real time across the EDAM footprint, and then appropriate compensation for it also.
Yeah, that makes good sense. I think the other area of question that I sort of had on this is when thinking about the different things that sort of RUC achieves today, and some of the reports that are out there that kind of show the breakout of some of it's for dealing with the net short process of adjusting for renewable forecasts and schedules and that sort of thing. Some of it's for truing up between the load serving entities forecasts and the CAISO's forecasts, and then there's that layer that's maybe more imbalance related around the uncertainty. And I guess the curiosity is when you're going into trying to assess some of these benefits, how do you deal with the potential changing nature of those drivers? Did demand schedule differently this summer than they did last summer? Was it more accurate? And kind of where might those drivers go in the future that would cause one type of product to be more useful than another? Like if you're just truing up for difference in a load serving entity's forecast versus CAISO's forecast, can that be met with one type of a resource versus if you're looking for 5 and 15-minute ramp capability, then that's got to come from a different type of resource. It's not a very well-formed thought, but I'm just kind of reviewing these slides this morning. So
yeah, Dan, I think what you're getting to is what we're saying on this first sub-bullet of the second bullet. RUC schedules meet energy needs, not changes in energy needs. So, imbalance reserves are not intended to cover the difference between what supply happened to clear in the IFM and the forecast. That's will still be achieved through RUC, through what we're rebranding as reliability capacity up and reliability capacity down. What imbalance reserves are replacing is, or what they're doing is they're addressing net load uncertainty and ramping differences that would exist even if the market cleared right at the demand forecast. But RUC is meeting differences in hourly schedules. So, for example, if for the peak hour the market clears below the forecast, RUC can commit a resource that ramps, like a turtle, and can ramp all day up to that peak hour, and that serves RUC's purpose. But RUC isn't so good for responding to flexibility, for providing flexibility in real time, or more precisely, ramping needs, which imbalance reserves are based on the 15-minute ramp capability. So when the operator biases RUC to get ramping capability, it might result in just getting the turtle resource that can meet that peak load when what the operator needs or what the system needs is that faster ramping capability.
And this is James. I just want to add that in terms of the drivers of RUC, I think you nailed them, and I don't think that those are going away, and I don't think that imbalance reserves are intended to address those. Which is why, in our current proposal, we've kept with RCU and RCD, and precisely to meet those specific things. I think the counterfactual that we have to evaluate against is the RUC adjustments, which in our mind are the operator's way of procuring a market product that doesn't exist, and that's where the imbalance reserves come in and are intending to replace the need to do that. And the question is, that we, would be helpful to know is, does, the resources that are committed and scheduled in through the RUC adjustments, better or worse than what you could get by taking that need for a RUC adjustment, putting it into an imbalance reserve requirement, co-optimizing it with energy and reserves and ISM. And our contention is that it would be much more efficient to do that than to rely on those out-of-market actions.
Yeah, that all makes intuitive sense in talking through it. And I think the last kind of area of question I had is when you're doing this analysis, and I understand having to kind of go back to a test case in one of the last 2 summers that had the high demand, but for imbalance. But are you also able to kind of look forward to what the grid is going to look like, either next year or 2-3 years from now, when potentially we have multiple thousands of more megawatts of non-turtle storage resources that are going to be able to meet a lot of this need, price depending, and kind of to be able to look at how the market might have performed if it had that level of flexibility in some of these past cases?
I don't think in the short run we'll be able to get analysis exactly like that, but one thing we can do is what we're doing is calculating historical imbalance reserve requirements, over the past 5 years or so, potentially you could see in that data trends in the imbalance reserve requirement itself. Is the trend increasing? Are there patterns in seasonality or times of day where you may be able to project some sort of future trend on that? But yeah, I think it is important to understand how the imbalance reserves will work under a changing grid. I'm just not sure under the with the tools that we have available to us that we'd be able to like precisely model under a world of this much renewables and this much storage, what might the imbalance reserves be, even though that is an important question.
This is Brad again. That's a good example. You want IFM to schedule the. I hope I don't coin a new term here. You want IFM to, if IFM has had two resources, it had a total resource and a storage resource, you would want IFM to schedule the total resource to meet the hourly schedules. And this is a big generalization, but the concept, you would want the total resource to meet the hourly schedules, and you would want to keep the storage for fast ramping that you need for just ramping in the real-time market that can be faster than the day-ahead market, because the day-ahead market's just modeling hourly ramps, and then also to respond to imbalances that occur due to variability, particularly due to burrs. So you would want to schedule the hourly resource for the hourly schedule changes and keep the battery for fast changes. But IFM doesn't know that today. The IFM could well have scheduled the battery to meet the hourly schedules, and this is a big generalization. I know batteries can't last all day, but you could schedule the battery to meet the hourly schedules, and then we would get the turtle resource through the RUC conformances to respond to uncertainty. And obviously that doesn't, that's not the optimal way to do it.
This is Scott. One thing, all this is good discussion, but one thing is I don't think you ought to focus too exclusively just on the high load days. I think how efficiently we procure flexibility on other days is important too. And study a variety of days and say, okay, when the operators increase the RUC forecast by 2,000 megawatts, how much of that transferred into, did that transfer into 10%, 15-minute ramp and 20% 30-minute ramp, or 40% and 60%? How much? What's the trade-off between the operators goosing the load conformance or forecast in RUC, and what percentage that turns up in 15-minute and 30-minute ramp capability would be a good indicator of how well the RUC forecasts are working and whether we need to make a change. But on all days, not just high load days.
And Scott, does that lead to, and sorry, it's my last kind of question or line of thought on that, does that lead to into thinking about just the price performance impact of the imbalance reserve product, and kind of how real-time prices will shape up if we're procuring that uncertainty envelope on a consistent basis?
Yeah, if it turns out that the RUC is not doing a good job of providing ramp, I mean, it's complicated because if the operators know that if they goose RUC by 1,000 megawatts, they'll only get 50 megawatts of ramp, well, then they're going to goose it by 2,000 megawatts. So it's a complicated of how things will change if we have a better way for the operators to get the ramp they need. But maybe it'll turn up in lower commitment costs because the operators will be able to get what they want, which is ramp, without huge adjustments to the load forecast. But there is an element that's going to be hard to sort out too accurately.
Well, thanks for indulging the questions. I hope that was some helpful inquiry.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Adam, I think we might have somebody else on the line as well.
We do have one or two more commenters. I'm going to go to the phone first because we have someone who's been waiting a bit. Caller, your line's being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. This is Alvis Svoboda from PG&E. There were a lot of points brought up by Dan, almost so many that it's hard to recover what I was going to bring up as my original comment. But I think the two things I wanted to, which are basically directly carrying on what was just said, is I think Brad's example is a good and a bad one in the sense that it points to the need for the flexibility, but it doesn't necessarily fix that the solution to that is the procurement of a day-ahead product based on an uncertainty forecast at that point in time. And I think it's worth thinking about alternative solutions. For example, increased flexible ramping procurement in real time with some additional assurance that flexible RA would, for example, tend to guarantee that kind of capacity would be available in the real-time market. The other point following on Scott's was that we were seeing what the RUC adjustments look like currently, and there are many hours currently where the RUC adjustments are zero, and we would have to believe, based on the construction of the imbalance reserve products, that we're going to see costs in those hours. So in terms of the cost versus benefits, the additional costs in those hours, if you're just strictly going to look at the benefits from the reduction in RUC adjustments, would need to include those additional costs in those other hours. Thank you.
Thanks, Alva. Is there somebody else on the line?
This is Scott. I agree that we ought to look at all the hours and see if there's anything about the imbalance reserve product that would cause it to schedule additional imbalance reserves when we don't appear to need it in RUC. So that'd be good to look at. I agree.
All right, if we're ready to move on, I do have another commenter on the line. Your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. It's Mark Simons at Bonneville Power Administration. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. All right, so I have two lines of questions. One is just more process, so I'll ask that first. Some of this analysis could get pretty complex, as we've already talked about. What's the general time frame that's being considered for conducting this analysis? And the second process question is, some of this work has at least already been started 2 years ago in the price performance report, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to build on material that was already put together in that time frame. First, any comments on the process element?
I'd like to answer that if possible, or Brad. Yeah.
What? Yeah, this is Brad. I'll start. Maybe Guillermo can add on. In the DAME stakeholder process, we've been getting pushback on the need for imbalance reserves and whether we really need a new market product and can continue to do it through RUC adjustments and request that we quantify things better. And so that's why we're taking this opportunity at the MSC meeting to not talk about the DAME design details, but go back and talk about some of the benefits that we talked about a couple of years ago when we started off DAME. But I think through further considering, I think we've come to a better grasp of the benefits. So we wanted to both refresh the benefits and then take a fresh look at them. As far as the timing of the analysis, we put out our revised roadmap where we're no longer looking at implementing DAME in 2022, 2, and the plan is to implement it together with EDAM in 2023. So we have a little bit more time, and on the roadmap, we show DAME going out sometime mid-year, and I think we have leeway a little bit either way. So some of this analysis we have done already. That's listed. It's not completely finished and ready for all of it isn't completely finished and ready for public consumption yet. So we're not presenting it today, but like James said, we will. And then the last bit of the analysis, where looking at the nature of existing RUC commitments versus what imbalance reserve would do, we haven't done yet. So some of that will depend on what this conversation here, and honestly, some of the time frame for this will depend, I think, on the next presentation, where we talk about resource sufficiency evaluation, where there might be requests for more analyses, and the same people are doing both analyses. So I think the timing is a little bit up in the air. I think our intent here is to agree on these principles, or to agree to disagree on these principles, and get a general framework for these analyses, and then go back to working on the details of DAME as we complete doing these analyses, and then share these. Do you have anything you want to say, Adam, Guillermo?
Not really, but I think I would say that the timing of the analysis is going to be flexible and is going to somehow fit into the overall framework that we have for the initiative. So it's not an item in isolation. It's going to be in synchronization with the overall initiative.
This is Anna. I would reinforce that there isn't any intent to delay the initiative as a result of this analysis, but it would fit into our process as we go along and continue to develop the elements.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the questions. And
yeah,
Anna,
I was just going to say appreciate the feedback on the process. Just wanted an opportunity to ask a couple questions on the substance. I think going back to the origination of this particular product, I think there were some pretty key elements that were focused in terms of the reasons for why to do this, and some of them have been touched on here, but maybe not as much in the slides. I think it would be good to know how important the DEC capability remains for the ISO, because that's an important element that I think is not well captured through the status quo environment today. And then building on the discussion earlier about the feasibility of the IFM schedules, I think that's another piece that could play into this analysis now that we've seen how the RUC adjustments tend to work from this past summer. And then I know it's difficult, but the deliverability, somehow that was one of the key advantages going back. So we all know the problem is the uncertainty and the quantity of it. That's part of it. Part of the other problem is the downward nature, which speaks to the DEX. But the third one was the ability to have that product more deliverable when and where it's needed. We all recognize that's complicated, but I think if there's something that we can do to get at each of those three elements, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Danny or Guillermo, you want to have anything to say in reply? If not, Danny, you can go ahead to the next slide.
Okay, slide 4. So the previous slide, another way to think about the way that these benefits are broken up is the previous slide sort of provides benefits of the imbalance reserve product in the IFM, whether or not the imbalance reserve product includes a non-zero bid. So, there are some stakeholders that have suggested in the past that, you could include the imbalance reserves in the IFM, but require them consistent with today to continue to bid $0 if they're an RA resource for this product. And this slide kind of gets at some of the benefits of having a non-zero bid for imbalance reserves rather than the sort of system level bids. And really it comes down to the fact that providing non-zero bids, we believe, would allocate these flexible reserves based on costs rather than other elements. And that has several advantages as seen in these sub-bullets. One is that resources can be properly compensated for their variable availability costs. So the sub-bullet to this has some examples of variable availability costs that may not be captured in the way that RUC is done today. You can get bid cost recovery and recover some of your fixed availability costs, but these other costs of scheduling costs of natural gas, setting up a hydro system, having demand response, making changes so that demand response can be available at certain times, have variable components to it that if resources were able to bid those costs through a market product like imbalance reserves could recover them. Secondly, because of the non-zero cost nature, the market software would be able to better distinguish the trade-off in costs and performance in making awards and unit commitment decisions, which would lead to more economic solutions. Third, the imbalance reserve payment through the market should reduce the RA capacity revenue requirements of flexible resources that provide RUC capacity to meet imbalance reserve needs or imbalance needs, and that's something that Scott Harvey went over in the MSC presentation in August, where we described the incentive structure of RUC is such that flexible reserves flexible resources, because they tend to have lower commitment costs and other performance advantages, non-cost performance advantages, tend to get picked up in RUC and then are not compensated for that outside of their not compensated for that through market payments. And so if resources were receiving revenue through market payments for this type of service, that should lower the RA contract payments that are needed for them. The fourth sub-bullet is that market, having the market provide, a nodal price essentially for flexibility sort of reveals the cost and need of flexibility at certain places and at certain times on the system, which can inform both short-term upgrades that can be made at specific locations or potentially even longer-term investments. And finally, and importantly, the imbalance reserves provide a financially binding schedule in the IFM that provides better performance incentives. And I think about that two ways. One is that today, resources get RA resources don't get a RUC payment for their real-time availability. So if for some reason that resource is not available, the penalty of taking back $0 essentially nets out to no no penalty at all. Of course, there's energy imbalance charges and other things that could happen, but specifically for the capacity, there's really no financial penalty. Whereas if you are getting a non-zero imbalance reserve payment, there is some revenue that can be, there is some, payment that can be taken back. The other way to think about this is, the way that we've, at least in our latest proposal, designed the deviation settlement for imbalance reserves, that potentially resources that are not available to deliver on their imbalance reserves obligation could be charged back in real time more than their imbalance reserve payment if potentially they cause the supply of flexible reserves to shrink, and thus increasing the flex grant price in FMM or something higher than the imbalance reserve price. They could be exposed to higher costs in the real time if they're unavailable. And so, for those reasons, those are some reasons that we think, outside of just the system level sort of optimization benefits, that, adding on a non-zero bid ability for imbalance reserves would provide several, efficiencies. So I'll stop there and see if the MSC has any comment or the public has any comment.
Thanks, James.
All right.
I don't have any comments.
Sorry, go ahead. We
Jim?
do have a hand raised on the phone line. Sorry, go ahead. Should we go ahead and go to the phones?
Jim and Scott don't have anything to add. I don't either, so we can go to the phones.
All righty, thank you. Caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, this is Michelle Quito from the CPUC Energy Division, and I think I made this point before in the previous MSC, and I would just note that it's possible that it won't reduce RA costs if we have, 10-year agreements. So recall that the CPUC authorized 14,000 plus megawatts, and those are 10-year contracts. So it's not clear that it would necessarily reduce costs. So just when you're calculating the benefits, you have to calculate the fact that in some cases we have long-term RA agreements. And then the second thing is, there might be the benefits that you talk about, but also I would just note that in terms of the potential costs, there are potential reliability costs if you get rid of the resource adequacy real-time must-offer obligation, right? So right now we can pull them into the real-time, but, given your proposal, the real-time must-offer obligation would go away. And so we could potentially lose all of those resources. And I think that has, reliability consequences, and potentially, that goes on the other side of the ledger. So those are the 2 points I'd like to make. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Brad. Michelle, the point about losing the RA real-time must-offer obligation, I appreciate that point, and maybe this is an analysis we can do, because one consideration is the RA real-time must-offer obligation does not necessarily get you everything, because it only gets the resources that can start in real time. And so, when you're counting on that, obviously you don't have the resources that can't start in real time, where imbalance reserves can commit longer start resources, the resources that can't start in real time, to be available in real time. And, maybe there's something we could do to quantify that. But yeah, I don't think that blanketly we can say that the RA real-time must-offer obligation is necessarily providing more capacity than imbalance reserves would in real time.
This is Scott Harvey. I think it would be interesting to look at the performance of, resources that did not get a RUC schedule, did not get a day-ahead market schedule, and how often they're actually available in real time to put some quantitative kick into this.
Okay. Thanks, Michelle. Adam, do we have anybody else on the phone lines?
Do not have any additional comments in the queue at this time.
There's one thing I wanted to add on the financially binding schedules is if the way it works, the flexible resources that are committed isn't really free because they get paid flexi ramp. So what it is if you're committed in IFM, you get your commitment costs are sucked up, and then there's no binding financial obligation to be available in real time. But if you are, you get paid for flexi ramp in real time, which could be zero or it could be high. If we fix flexi ramp, it may be high more of the time and low, when we don't need it. So that's, the financially binding, and the deviations, remember, means that they're going to get paid in the IFM instead of get paid in real time. It isn't that they're going to get paid now where they weren't before, but the people everybody gets get paid day ahead if they're flexible, and then we'll be settling deviations in real time.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, James, you want to proceed?
We'll go to the last slide. Okay, so the benefits that we've discussed up to this point are, in our current IFM formulation, but we thought it was important to also discuss benefits of imbalance reserves looking forward to an EDAM. And, these again are benefits that'll have to be borne out more specifically once, the EDAM design becomes more concrete. But just generally, we've listed a few here. First is that the scheduling of reserve capacity can be optimized across the EDAM footprint, and I think of that in terms of the diversity benefit that imbalance reserves could bring, similar to the diversity benefit in the EIM, where resources or BAAs can share in the diversity benefit for flexible ramping product. The same could be said for EDAM with imbalance reserves, where BAAs could share in a diversity benefit for day-ahead flexibility as well, which lowers costs for the EDAM participants. The second is because imbalance reserves would be optimized within IFM, it also goes to show then that EDAM transfers that would also be optimized through the IFM, and reserve capacity would be also considered with the imbalance reserve product. Thus, the IFM can consider the needed reserves for flexibility when it's scheduling transfer quantities specifically. And then the third benefit we wanted to bring up is that by having imbalance reserves actually provides some reliability benefits in a few ways. One is that you have a consistent treatment of uncertainty across BAA, so every BAA is subject to the same uncertainty requirements, and thus that should improve the reliability of EDAM transfers. On top of that, because imbalance reserves have a real-time must-offer obligation, EDAM participants can feel more comfortable by by transferring the uncertainty between themselves because there's a real-time must-offer obligation. And so, without the imbalance reserves and its associated real-time must-offer obligation, there may not be incentive to sort of follow through on the commitments to each other. So I'll stop there and see if there's any comments.
Adam, is there anybody on the line?
We do not have anyone in the queue. We do have one commenter in the queue. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Dan from Customized Energy Solutions again. I just kind of counteracting my point before about considering EDAM is just that also, having to consider that, it's unlikely that all of the EIM converts to EDAM on whatever, January 1st, 2024. And so, thinking about the supply pool in terms of still having EIM entities, still having entities who are neither in EDAM nor EIM, and all of that. I know it's complex, but it feels like it kind of has to be done in order to be planning for what this really looks like in 2024, 25 timeframe.
Okay, thank you, Dan. James, if you are done, I think this is the last slide. Unless there are any closing comments, we will be breaking for lunch. Any closing comments from the MSC members or James?
Not from Scott.
Not from Jim.
Okay. Well, I get to then convey the good news that it's time for a half-hour lunch break. We will reconvene at, let's see, it's 3:15 Eastern time, so that would be 12:45. We'll reconvene at 12:45 Pacific time. If I got my adding 3 hours correctly. So Adam,
a half hour.
Yep. Okay. So it says 12:30, but let's take a full half hour if that's okay. And we will see you at 12:45. Thanks everybody, and thanks James for the presentation and everybody for the discussion. Hi, everybody. This is Ben Hobbs, Chair of the MSC, welcoming you back to the remainder of our meeting. We will go for until 2 p.m. Sharp, because there's a stakeholder call at that time. And between now and then, we have the pleasure of Dr. Guillermo Batista, who will be talking about resource efficiency evaluation, focusing on its performance on July 9th. So this was one particular day, but there are I think there's some general lessons from this day about how conformance affects imports and resource efficiency. And so we're looking forward to seeing the information. Guillermo has quite a bit to share with us. So Guillermo?
Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic in the session. And as a background to this discussion, as participants may recall, we have been posting monthly performance reports of the summer conditions. For the report of July, we touched on several items that are going to be rediscussed here. Just for completeness, we really focus on the summer conditions overall. It was not a focus dedicated to the resource efficiency evaluation. We touched on the enhancements that were implemented in the summer. But the conversation we would like to have in this session today is more about the specifics of the resource efficiency evaluation, and more specifically about the capacity test. I'm not going to be covering the balancing or the flexible ramping test, but it's going to be very narrow to the capacity test. And I think it's important to try to bring this type of analysis for discussion. We have initiatives regarding the resource efficiency evaluation enhancements, and I think this type of analysis can help to have a very good conversation with some facts of what really happened. Granted, this is a very specific day. We are focusing on July 9th because that was the most critical day. And people may recall that this is the day when we have an emergency. We were in a very tight supply condition. And naturally, the question arises as to how the resource efficiency evaluation worked on that specific day. The work that we have for this session is quite similar, at least the first half, to what we presented for the resource efficiency evaluation back of August 14, 16 to 2020. That was kind of the same dynamic. And the second part of the presentation goes beyond the resource efficiency evaluation and starts exploring the implications and interplays that we may have with the transfers, the imports, the penalty prices, and the load conformance that are actuating in the real-time market. With that, let me start the discussion. And once I have more than 10 slides, it's hard to manage the time. So I think we have a limited time. I will try to glance quick through the first part that is somehow similar and known material for other days that we have introduced, and then we can spend more time in the second part of the presentation. Next slide, please. I don't see my screen updating. I don't know if it's really moving or not.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. This is just background. And when we are talking about the resource efficiency evaluation, specifically to the capacity test, we are with the principle of ensuring that by the time we have to run the test, in general, I'm going to be referring to the last test, that is the one that is binding because that is the one that is utilized downstream. And to ensure that at that time, given the load requirements, we have enough capacity in the system through the supply to ensure that we can sustain that requirement. In addition to the load, we have introduced for some time now the intertie deviation adder, that is just to account for that historical deviation of interties. And recently, back in June 15, we introduced the uncertainty adder. That is the same uncertainty component that is used in the flexible ramping test. And if we have more capacity from the supply to meet at least the requirement of the capacity test, the test is going to pass. We discussed some time ago the nuances of taking the approach of an incremental version versus a gross version. The outcome is going to be the same. Sometimes looking at the incremental values is less intuitive. That is one of the reasons we move into the gross approach, because it's more natural to see when you talk about demand of 40,000 megawatts rather than demand of minus 1,800 megawatts. And that is just the relationship of the incremental versus the gross. And the critical piece here is the reference of what we call as G star, that is effectively the basis schedule for EIM entities. It is an advisory schedule for the CAISO because we don't have basis schedules. Next slide, please. This is a view of the incremental approach, and this is comparing the bit range capacity with the area in green versus the incremental requirement that is composed of load incremental requirement plus uncertainty plus intertie deviation. And the concept is very basic. As long as you have enough upward capacity, and that means that it's going to be higher than the requirement, the area is going to pass the test. And there are a couple of dots on the upper part of the plot indicating the instances in which the CAISO failed the capacity test, and that was in our ending 19 on July 9. For some metrics, I'm trying to give you a broader trend of 3 days, including the neighboring days around July 9, just to give you a sense of the trend. And as we progress through the conversation, I will focus more and more on the specifics of the peak hours of July 9. And in this picture, it's hard to see given the order of the capacity test, but you can see that there are, generally speaking, very few intervals in the day in which naturally the upward capacity is going to be at its lowest. And it's going to be like a mirror view of the demand, because as we start going through the increasing demand, the capacity that is available naturally becomes loaded, and you have less and less capacity available because you are meeting increasing levels of demand. So naturally, you would expect that by the time you reach the peak time is when your level of upward capacity is going to be at its minimum. And if you really run out of capacity, that is simply meaning that you have exhausted all your resources that you have available to meet the demand. Next slide, please. This is a different approach just to highlight the composition, the generation mix of the upward capacity that we have for this period of time. In some cases, you may see some missing pieces because in some cases the market doesn't run, it may have failed. And in this case, you can have at least 2 hours where that was the case. And this is the same trend as the previous one. It's just broken out by the technology type. And we have MSG, we have PDR, imports, exports, you name it. And you can see the composition in the peak hour, right, around hour ending 18 through 21, when the capacity is the minimum. And the composition effectively tell us that around that time, the only incremental capacity that was available or left available for meeting the incremental demand was generally made up of MSG units. And that is the portion that you can see for our ending 19, 20 on July 9th. That is the green area on that specific point on time. Next slide, please. This is a more narrow view of the same picture just for the very critical hours, hour ending 17 through 21, and just to give you a zoom into the information. And again, you can see that clearly the capacity that was available by the time we were in this emergency condition around hour ending 18, 19, 20, it was largely made up of MSG units. There is some incremental capacity from other type of technologies, but they are minimal. Next slide, please. And this is just the composition of the requirements. Similar to the composition of the upward capacity, the bid range, we also have the counterparty of the demand. In this case, it's an incremental requirement that is composed of the incremental load, the variation of the load, plus the others for intertie deviation and uncertainty. And that just gives you some perspective, some feeling of the size, the relative size of one other versus the other. And in some cases, around the critical time of July 9, our ending 1920, you can see that it can be in either direction because, again, this is an incremental approach, and that is one of the complications to look the capacity test through the glance of an incremental approach. There may be one question here: what happened in our ending 14 when everything seems to be out of reference? The capacity test starts from the advisory information that we have from the 15-minute market. In some cases, in other metrics, you're going to see that we have, in some cases, missing information for that hour because we have some failures. So when we have some failures, we have to fall back to some other value. So we take a fallback reference value, and that is the reason it may look out of synchrony with the rest of the period. Next slide, please. This is changing perspective. This is an approach based on the gross capacity. This is total supply versus total requirement. And the supply here is composed of internal CAISO generation, the net schedule interchange, that is effectively imports minus exports. And in some cases, you can see that net interchange is actually zero or negative, meaning that we have more exports than imports, and therefore, when you have that condition of a net schedule interchange to be negative, that is a net export, you are not really adding capacity or bit range to the test because it's in the opposite direction. And the upper part is still the incremental calculation that we have from the incremental approach. So all these three components together make up the overall capacity that was available from supply resources to meet the requirements in the capacity test. And the line in black and dark and red is just the trend of the total gross requirement that we have. That accounts for the demand, plus the uncertainty, plus the intertie deviation others. And the same outcome is going to be achieved here, indicating that around past the peak hour in our ND19, you can see that the shaded area is below the dark line, indicating that we have a requirement that is above the capacity that is available, and therefore the CAISO area is going to fail at that point on time. Next slide, please. Similar to the discussion we had some time ago when we discussed the conditions of August 2020, this information so far just tells you what happened in the test. It doesn't explain why we pass or why we fail the test in this critical period. As we discussed previously, in order to get closer to understand why we pass or why we fail, or why the capacity test was accounting for certain capacity, we need to have a reference, and that reference has to be another type of capacity in a different point on time that is a good reference to tell us whether the capacity test properly projected the capacity that eventually was made available to run the market and was operationally available. And we have some debate about this reference, what it should be. And what we have done, similar to using the same approach of August 2020, is to rely on the capacity that is available in the real-time interval dispatch. And that is the last opportunity for the market to see resources, to see supply and dispatch them accordingly. One of the limitations of this reference is that it's going to be on a 5-minute basis. It's going to rely on what is available right away for the next 5 minutes. It's not going to consider that there may be capacity that you can start up if you may have a picker, for instance, it may not consider that available. If you have energy units that can transition in 15 minutes, that capacity is not going to be seen. So it's really in the very short term, as close as it could be to the actual operation of the system. And if you take this reference to analyze something, let's say at 8 in the morning, naturally you are going to see that there is a lot of missing capacity, not because we don't have it. It's just because it's not committed, it's not readily available, it's not ramp accessible, because at that time of the day, you don't need it. Why you would have 40,000 megawatts of capacity loaded and ready synchronized when your load is half of that? So it's a natural consequence. I think the criticality is that when we are looking at very high loading conditions, typically the peak, that is when it makes sense to use this metric, because at that point in time, you expect that everything is going to be up and running, and it's a matter of quantifying how much you really have available. Let's move forward a couple of slides, please.
I'm going to move forward one more.
2 more, please. Yeah, sorry, one before. And similar to what we did for August 2020, we track and try to reconcile the capacity that was used and projected in the capacity test versus the capacity that was available in the real-time market close to the 5-minute operation. And we track that by technology, because it's a good way to aggregate that to see if there is any trend. We have the information at the resource level already, but it would be not feasible just to present resource by resource. This gives you the first round, the first level of information of where gaps may exist. And the first one that we analyze, obviously, is the imports. And there are different trends here. I don't want to overload the visualization of this, but it's important to keep all this in reference. We have the capacity test, the capacity that was made available and utilized in the test to run it, and that is with a trend in red. The trend in green is the real-time capacity that was made available in the 5-minute operation of the system. And then you have 3 other trends. One that is the actuals for internal resources, that is basically the pulse, the signal of actual production. And we also put the HASP awards just to have a reference where HASP was projecting. That makes more sense for interties. And also the ROC awards, just to see from the day-ahead perspective how we were projecting to have the capacity available. This is just to give you a more complete picture of the supply evolution over time across the different markets. And you can see here that ideally we would like to see all the lines overlapping, right? The capacity in the day ahead tracks closely to what comes into the real time, and the capacity test is accounting for that precise capacity. And you can see, at least for a reference here in the first hours of this day, they are tracking very closely, meaning the capacity that was projected in the day ahead matches the real-time one and matches the one used in the capacity test. That is an ideal outcome. As we go into the afternoon of July 9, you can see that there is a divergence, and this is very simple to explain. You can see that there is a divergence between the capacity that was made available in the test, that is the red behind the blue one in the upper part, versus the real-time capacity that is in green in the lower part, overlapping with the actuals. And the gap is effectively an over-accounting of capacity in the capacity test. That means the capacity test used extra capacity that eventually was not available in the real-time market. The obvious question is, how can that be for this specific day? And the difference is not noise, it's quite significant. You can take a reference of 2 points And if you see, for instance, our ending 17, the difference is at least 2,000 megawatts. So how can it be that we are so off between the capacity test and the real-time market? And the reason is quite simple. If we move to the next slide, please. The reason is, on that afternoon, we have the rates applied dynamically in the real-time market on Malin and not interties because there were some lines tripping offline due to fire impact. And once that event happened, we have to reduce the capacity on the interties because we no longer have that extra supply. The market, and this is the topic of the discussion with the stakeholders at 2 p.m., and we have explained this also in the July report. The market, there are two components. The first one is timing. Even if an event happens right now, it will take a natural time for each of the sub-markets in the real time to internalize the information. If something happens right now, the first market to pick it up is naturally going to be the RTD market because it's going to be running every 5 minutes. Naturally, the next one that is going to pick it is going to be the 15-minute market because it runs every 15 minutes. And depending on the timing, if it happens anytime after minute 47, the only chance for the HASP market to pick that information and factor in that information is going to be until the next hour run, just because the HASP runs once an hour. So the timing of the event matters for when the markets are going to be able to factor in that information. That is one condition. That is the reason you can see that even though the event started specifically at some point on time, each market internalized the rates at different times with some latency. That is natural to happen when you have different markets running at different times. That is one condition. So when the test, the capacity test is going to run, the last run relies on information obtained from running the 15-minute market. And it's only one of the runs of the 15-minute market that is used for reference of the capacity test. If that run misses the timing of the derate, that test for that hour is not going to see the implications of the derate. It's going to be until next hour. And that is what really happened here. That explains partially why we have this discrepancy between the test and the real time. The real time was right away. The test has to pick it up until the next natural run. The second interplay here is what we explain in terms of overscheduling. Given the current construct, given the current parameters that we use for scheduling priorities, and some of them, like intertie constraint penalty prices, are prescribed in the tariff to be specific numbers. 1215 the hash market, 1500 in the ROC process. And we cannot change those until we change the tariff, and that is the stakeholder process we're initiating. The consequence of that is that for these specific days, given the heavy derates, and you can see for the HASP market, for instance, we are talking about a derate that went from 3,000 to 285 megawatts. It's a tenfold reduction of capacity. The market solution attained the best solution it could with the implication of violating or overscheduling the intertie constraint. If the limit was, as you can see in the green portion, 285, the market is still clear about 2,000 megawatts of interties on that Malin constraint because of the interplay that we have with the scheduling parameters. This capacity somehow is capacity that is not available because once we run the hash market and it's time for tagging and so on, our operators are going to effectively curtail those overschedules to bring it within the limit. So they do not realize. However, from the point of view of the market that eventually fits that information into the capacity test, that overscheduling is going to be seen as additional supply. And that is the second component that makes up that gap between the capacity seen by the test and the real-time market. Next slide, please. This is more targeted to highlight the trend only for capacity associated with Malin and NOP. And you can see it's relatively in the same trend because we have this large gap between what actually happened in the real-time market versus what was projected in both the 15, the hash market, and the capacity test. That would explain in general why we have this over-accounting of capacity in the test. Once we go through the process of updating those penalty prices that requires a tariff change, this issue shouldn't be present anymore because it's the whole objective of this initiative to change the penalty prices to the point where we do not allow the overscheduling of interties. But this is what happened on July 9th.
This is Scott. Isn't there another thing that happened that the CAISO began modeling load as reserves at 1830, and under the proposals that the CAISO has in mind and proposed here, that would cause the CAISO to fail the test anyway?
Yes, once we're in the new paradigm, Scott, of the enhancements, as long as they go and get implemented, you are right. The proposal is that once we are in a mode of arming load, by default, they are going to be failed intervals.
Right, thanks.
Yeah. Ben, I think this could be a good time to see if we have any questions or follow-ups.
Thank you, Guillermo. Let's see. Adam, is there anybody waiting on the phone lines?
Do not have anyone in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay. Jim or Scott, anything else?
Not from Scott.
Not from Jim.
Okay. I think we're good, Guillermo.
Okay, let's move on then. Next slide, please. Similar to imports, we have some trends for different technologies. This is the one for solar, and the next one is going to be for wind. And the story here is that, you may recall, effective June 15, we introduced the uncertainty adder to the capacity test to account for the uncertainty precisely, right? As you can see here, you focus on our end in 18, 19, 20. That is a natural downward ramp. There was not much divergence between the capacity test, the real-time market capacity, and actually between the real-time capacity and actuals and HASP. That tells you that there was not much uncertainty realized around this time frame that could be a factor to consider. That is the main takeaway. Next slide, please. And similar thing for wind. And you can see that even we have the opposite condition. There was more capacity available in the real time than it was projected in the capacity test, at least prior to our ending 20. Around our ending 20, they track very closely one to another. Next slide, please. This is reliability demand response, and we don't include right now the actual because by the time we put this together, we haven't access to the final numbers of the performance. But this just compares against the capacity test that is a line in red that happens to be just at the 0 megawatt value all day long versus the capacity that was deployed in the real-time market. And this is an item that we discussed back in August 2020, in which the real-time market indeed have this extra 800 megawatts of capacity that were not seen in the capacity test. We were under accounting for the RDR capacity that eventually was in the real-time market but was not seen in the capacity test. As part of the summer enhancements, there was one specific item to try to close this gap. It's an under accounting of capacity because RDRs are not factoring into the capacity test. This, again, is July 9. The enhancements that brought that feature on took effect until August 4th. we would have been living the day where this functionality was already active on July 9th. You would expect to see that the capacity test would be a red line somewhere close to the green line. In this case, it was a full under accounting of that capacity in the test. Next slide, please. This is PDR. I would say you keep in mind the reference of the megawatt level is relatively mild, under 200 megawatts, and you can see that the capacity test was accounting for certain level of capacity, and the real-time market was tracking closely. As conditions evolved in the night, eventually the real-time market dispatched resources and made resources available up to that same amount. Next slide, please. This one is hydro, and hydro is kind of interesting because hydro historically carry operating reserves. And as Scott indicated earlier, there was a point in time where we start arming load, and that was in the evening of July 9. In general, you can see that for the peak hours, the capacity between the test and the real-time market track relatively well. When we reach the critical period of end of hour ending 19, 20, 21, you can see that the capacity made available in the real-time market was indeed higher than the capacity considered in the test. And that was because the hydro resources were performing above what was projected to be available. And in large part, that was because when we start arming load, we effectively are able to release operating reserves. And when they are released now, they are part of the bit supply, the bit stack for energy. They can be effectively converted from operating reserves into energy. And what you see right there is effectively the deployment and the activation of those reserves into energy. They were converted to energy, and therefore they were above the capacity that was limited to the energy portion in the capacity test. That was a capacity in excess in the real time in comparison to the capacity test. Next slide, please. This is storage. I think with a fast growth of storage, it's just interesting to see how they perform on these days in terms of capacity, and it's quite dynamic profile that you can see here. But if we focus on the critical hours, in the peak hours, you can see that in general, the capacity available in the real-time market was higher than the capacity considered in the capacity test. Next slide, please. And this is the one for MSGs. And let me try to connect the dots now, because this is one of the items that we discussed in the initiative and was widely discussed in the events of August 2020. You may recall in the first 2-3 slides that I introduced, the capacity that was considered to be still available in the critical hours of July 9th happened to be largely covered by MSG capacity. And the scale may not do justice here just because it's too large, but in general, we have over accounting of MSG capacity in the test. And when we track, there are maybe 5-6 units that contribute to that gap. But I think there are 3 main units that contributed to the majority of that gap of over-accounting the capacity in the test. One of the units was on outage and was trying to come back online. Eventually, I think it came back online way past the peak time. But when it was in the test, it had bits, it was considered to be available, and that capacity was accounted for. That is exactly the same interplay that we discussed that happened on August 14, 15 of 2020. And that is the genesis of the discussion of the policy initiative that we have. The second unit that contributed to that gap is not related to outage. It happens to be related to an intertemporal constraint, but this is a very interesting one, because one of the constraints that MSG resources have MSG, I mean multi-stage generator units, is the maximum daily number of transitions that they can go up or down. It happens that we have an MSG unit that has capacity for upper configurations. The market could not transition that resource to a higher configuration because it has already reached the maximum number of transitions for the day. They accrue earlier in the day. The capacity test is just accounting that the bit is there, the resource is available, it's not on outage, therefore the capacity is available. In the real-time market, the constraint kicks in and is unable to transition that resource up because it's a constraint that has to respect. That deprives the real-time market of additional capacity because of the hitting that constraint. The third unit is a very interesting case as well, and we are exploring if there is anything we can do in this regard. There have been some discussion, historical discussions of how we could improve the modeling of MSG units, and there are some complexities with some units. When we talk about MSG units, the concept is about configurations, and there is a specific mix of configurations that we have for certain units in which they may have overlapping configurations. You may have, for instance, 2x1 that goes from 100 to 200 megawatts, and then you have 3x1 that goes from 180 to 400. So you have a 20 megawatt range of overlapping in between two configurations. What we found is that for this specific day, for some reason that we have to investigate further, the telemetry that is a key component to the real-time market was oscillating and switching from one configuration to the other. It's a megawatt pulse that we get telling us and inferring for us where the unit is. And if it's in this overlapping range and you may start moving into one or the other, the market can easily understand whether it's in one configuration or the other. So having this oscillation of the telemetry posed a problem for the market to really determine where the configuration should be. And at some point in time, it may have believed that the unit was in a lower configuration, and therefore, for these 5 minutes, it could not access the capacity in an upper configuration, even though the unit was really available and the capacity was available. If needed, the operators could effectively go and exceptional dispatch the unit to force and break that oscillation of the telemetry to operate in a higher configuration. So in some sense, the 5-minute market was not able to see the capacity. The capacity indeed was available. Next slide, please. Okay, I'd like to take a pause here because I think we're going to switch in discussion, and I would like to understand if there are any comments or questions regarding the capacity test for July 9.
I think we have at least one caller on the line.
Yes, we do have a commenter on the line. You're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, Guillermo, good afternoon. It's Mark Simons with the Bonneville Power Administration. How are you doing this afternoon?
Hi, Mark. Nice to hear you.
Nice to hear you as well. Hey, going back to slide, I think it's 12. So if I'm understanding this correctly, and maybe this is a question of if you could just spell it out a little bit further. So there was an overschedule in the HASP, which led to incremental capacity that the CAISO was able to count in the resource sufficiency evaluation. And this amount of incremental capacity that was counted, I believe, based on the earlier slides, would exceed the amount of the imbalance requirement, irrespective of Scott's observation about the policy change regarding arming load. So I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, could you spell out a little further how just this one increment would have affected passing and failing the capacity test?
Yes, you are going to ask me to do math on the fly, Mark. Can we go back to the slide number 12 or so, operator, please? Yeah. And I wish I had more time to do that math, because you can see the point here of the whole set of slides, Mark, was to see the pluses and minuses, right? In some cases, like the imports, it was a plus because we were over accounting for that capacity. In some cases, that is going to be offset with the minuses when we were having more capacity in the real time. So if you see here, for instance, I don't know, let's pick our ending 18, right, where we have about, I would say, 700 megawatts of real-time capacity versus 1,700 megawatts of the test capacity. We're talking about 1,000 megawatts of capacity alone from the intertie over scheduling condition that was over accounted. This 1,000 alone, I would say, we can go back maybe a couple of slides more, is going to be large enough to be way in excess of the requirement, of the incremental requirement that we have for the real time. So trying to answer your question without having done the specific math, this gap would be large enough to meet the incremental requirement. And can we go back? Let me see what other slide will be useful. Can we start going back a couple of slides? I want to find one that is one more. Keep going, please.
I think it's slide 6 that you're looking for, Guillermo.
Yeah, this one would be useful. So our ending 18, 19. So here we have on average, I would say it's about 1,000, right? You see our ending 18 is oscillating between maybe 500 to 1,100. So there would be some intervals in which that component alone would have been enough to fail the test. And I could do the math, Mark, to be precise. I see specifically what the question is.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. And then I think it would be helpful to then merge that with Scott's question is, would the effect from that alone have lasted longer or shorter than the policy change about arming load? Because at the end of the day, I think that the principle that we're after is to have the test functioning accurately and transparently, the ability to automatically have the imports limited by the arming load policy change is more of a stopgap, if you will, at least from our
from my practical recollection, I can tell you we stopped arming the load, I believe, by 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. It was very nicely at the end of the hour. And I believe the overscheduling lasted until hour ending 22. Not to the same extent, but it was still transpiring that far into the night. So it may be around the same time. So yeah, I will get something more specific to that.
Sounds great. And then one other question kind of on the MSG, which I think was slide, I forget, the one we were just on.
Yeah. Okay.
Which, if any, of those three would have been picked up by the proposed changes in the draft final proposal? Or
for sure, the first one, that is the most meaningful one, that the one that was on outage, that tripped off a line and couldn't come back. That is going to be within the scope of the initiative. The other two are more like operational conditions, right? And this is one of the caveats I wanted to create when we talk about what is the reference of considering actual capacity, right? And having the 5-minute reference as the capacity has some limitations that I want to make sure I convey properly. If we can say that that capacity is not available in that 5 minutes, it doesn't mean that it cannot be available in the next 15 minutes, right? And for the third unit that I was explaining, that the unit was oscillating in that critical range of overlapping to confuse the logic, whether it was in one configuration or the other. The unit indeed, when we see the profile over the day, the unit indeed move up to the higher configuration. It happens when you take the snapshot against the test. For some specific point on time, you are going to see that that capacity is considered over accounting. But I would challenge a little bit that. I'm trying to be transparent here, just on the concept that we are using to build the delta. Because at the end of the day, physically, that capacity was indeed available. It was a matter of whether the market was able to move quick enough that resource at that point on time. And eventually, it did it, but it depends on what the reference you're using. For the second one, that is the number of transitions being exhausted for the day. That's a tricky one because it's an operational constraint and it depends on the operations of the real time. So we keep track of the transitions through the day, and that is another constraint that we have to consider in the operation of MSG units. I don't think that is within the scope of the initiative at this point. I think Dan is on the phone and may elaborate more if needed.
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo. I think on the third MSG, to the extent that it was in the upward configuration within that stuck horizon that we're proposing and then was transitioned down, that transition down that wouldn't allow it to go back up, I think would be captured and credited since that was a market decision. If that transition down occurred prior to that horizon, then I don't think it would be credited under the current proposal.
What about the second one?
Oh, with the telemetry, I think it would have been offered.
Oh, no, not the telemetry, but I guess we're confusing our second and third one.
Yeah, sorry, I think Danny just answered the second one, Mark. The third one is the telemetry one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the telemetry one would have been credited since the capacity was made available and could have been accessed in that current snapshot was due to a market decision.
Yeah, so if there could be a little bit more information on the second one there and the implications vis-a-vis the draft final proposal, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's something we can do, Mark.
Okay. Do you have any other questions, Mark?
No, not at this time. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions on the queue?
There was a hand raise. It's lowered now. Oh, I do see another hand raise. Sorry, were you going to make a comment? All right, hearing none. Let me go to the next caller. Your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Michelle Kita from the CPUC Energy Division. So I just wanted to go back to that last question. So to the extent that HASP was able to see that import was not available, wouldn't HASP also have cut the economic exports? So it's not that it would have failed, it's that it would have cut the economic exports, right?
I hear your question, Michelle. I'm not capturing the whole context of the question.
No, I think the point is that later in the day you cut thousands of megawatts of exports, and that's presumably when you saw that you didn't have the imports. So if you saw you didn't have the imports sooner, you would have cut the exports sooner.
Right.
Right, and then I just wanted to follow up on that. So when I look at the July report, it looks like as we were entering into the EEA2, in the day ahead, we'd cut pretty much all of the RUC, the economic exports in the RUC. So we were at zero, but they all rebid and they all flowed. So I'm really struggling with how we prioritize load versus economic export. So if we let the economic exports that reschedule in the real-time flow and therefore we fail the resource efficiency test, it's not necessarily that we don't have the capacity, right? It's that we made a choice to send it out. That's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
As was the case on the July 9th, right?
Yes, and I touched on that point at the end of the deck. Michelle, maybe we can hold a little bit and we can cover explicitly the implications of the exports. So I have some material for that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay.
So Guillermo, given the time, we should probably go ahead to the second half of your presentation. That's okay. And if we have time at the end, we can take any callers who we didn't take now.
Yeah. Can we jump forward to slide number 20, 21? Yeah, next one. Okay. This is going to be in a different context, but still quite related to the capacity test. And let me start with some trends for other dynamics that we have in the real-time market. This one shows you the trend over a period of the 3 days for the conformance that we utilize in the real-time market, July 8, 9, and 10. And each line represents a market, the hash conformance, RTPD conformance, RTD conformance. And in general, you can see this is a trend that we have seen in the past, in which the conformance utilized in the HASP, the outer scale, and the RTPD markets tend to be greater than the conformance in the real-time market. That is nothing new for this specific days based on history that we know. It's important to put in context the full day, because if we narrowly check on a few hours, you may get some biased perception of what's going on the system. Next slide, please. And what is the premise of having this load conformance, right? And I think we have discussed this in different forums. The main goal of having the conformance in the HASP and the 15-minute market is really to have this flexibility and position resource ahead of time, securing potentially more imports if possible, because that is the last opportunity for us to secure imports. When it comes to real-time dispatch, the RTD, the conformance is not more than to chase the imbalances that we have in the system. Imbalances from anything that can impact the power balance. Resources deviating, outages, and resources with latency, dragging to perform intertie deviation, you name it. Any imbalance is being threw up with the real-time conformance. And that is the reason you can see in the trend of the RTD conformance that is going to be more random, more surgical on 5-minute basis, because it's really chasing the imbalance. What does that mean? Effectively, you have higher conformance in HASP and FMM, and then you come into a much lower conformance in RTD. Effectively, the real-time interval dispatch is buying back the potential flexibility that we may have gained in the HASP market. It's important to mention that, yes, the conformance may drive to some extent some transfers, but they are financial. They are pre-dispatches. These are not operationally binding transfers. The only one that matters for the operation, for the balance of the actual system, is the 5-minute transfers. And for those, they are going to be determined based on the RTD conformance of the real-time dispatch and the overall economics of the real-time dispatch. In that sense, there is little implication of what the transfers were from the HASP and 15-minute market, rather beyond the financial implications. Next slide, please. This is now an overlapping, and I don't want to call this a correlation because it's not a correlation. This is an overlapping between two variables. One is the conformance that we have in each of the 3 markets, HASP, FMM, and RTD, versus the transfers that were in place for the CAISO. Positive values means an import transfer to the CAISO area. If you mistakenly narrow the view only for, let's say, the peak hours, you are going to easily get a biased assumption that, yes, the conformance is driving the transfers, because you can see it looks to be a nice correlation. It's not. And you can see just in these 3 days that there is no such correlation between bias and the levels of the transfers. So we need to be very cautious about trying to portray complete views to draw conclusions about causation. Next slide, please. This is a more narrow view of the transfers across the 3 markets, and it's important to look at in this way, because you can see the dynamics that really happen across the markets. The transfers are going to be driven not just by load conformance. Yes, load conformance is going to be a factor, but not the only one, nor the main one. there are in general lot movements up and down across not just the CAISO, across the whole area that is going to be driving the trend of the transfers. There will be load conformance, there will be congestion, and indeed, it's interesting because on July 9, some results that we see are driven by congestion, not in the CAISO, but in somewhere else in the EIM area. And in the end, it's going to be driven by economics. It's simply economic displacement, and that is going to dictate the level of the transfers we're going to have. When you see the level of transfers in HASP and RTPD versus the 5-minute market, you can see that the dynamics are quite different. And let me elaborate more on that. Next slide, please. This is a very narrow view of the peak hours of July 9. And I try to highlight a few key points here. The first one is that if you take, for instance, the middle of hour ending 18, even though we have 2,700 or so of 15-minute transfer or HASP transfers, when it comes to the actual transfers that realize in the 5-minute market, we are in the range of 1,300 megawatts. You see an overall buyback of 1,600 megawatts between the markets. The one in green, the one in RTD, is really the operationally meaningful transfer that makes sense to be discussing with in terms of operational implications. You can see that from the middle of hour ending 18 all the way through the middle of hour ending 20, persistently the RTD transfers coming into the ISO reduced by the many factors I explained earlier. Even though you have conformance sustained in the HASP and the 15-minute market, the ones that really matter in terms of the 5-minute market, they were consistently trending down. At some point during the critical time in hour ending 20, you can see that indeed the transfer that was an import became an export, because there could be somebody else that was in a greater need of that additional supply. In this case, we reverse the direction of the transfers. And in some cases, like the very beginning of hour ending 20, you can see the buyback is over 2,000 megawatts. Again, the reference of the 15 and the HASP transfers that may be influenced by the conformance of the 15 or the HASP market are somehow irrelevant when we come to the actual operational condition of the system that are, again, driven by the 5-minute market. When the case of fail either the capacity test or the flexible ramping test, you can see the implications. For instance, in hour ending 19, when we failed the capacity test, it was irrelevant because naturally the economics of the system were such that we were with import transfers way below the natural economics of the system. And this is important just to start putting in perspective what is really a meaningful transfer to discuss. And there are implications financially for the 15 and half transfers. The ones that are operational meaningful are the RTD, and you can see they are moving in a very different dynamic based on the actual real-time conditions. Next slide, please. And what follows is an analysis that we have done, a sensitivity analysis. This is a counterfactual analysis that we have done. And through the initiative discussion, there has been this lingering question, this set of assumptions and hypotheses and theories of if the CAISO has a load conformance of 2,000 megawatts, effectively the capacity test should see that additional capacity. First of all, I think we have proved a couple of workshops ago that the level of transfers into the capacity test is irrelevant because it's not an input. The capacity test is not built based on the EIM transfers. The implications could be more for the flexible ramping test. So what we have done is we have tried to quantify based on actual cases of what happened on July 9. What is the effect of having a load conformance into either the HASP market or the 15-minute market? Because I think that has been one of the key questions that we have been asked. And take, for instance, hour ending 19 and 20, and we start with HASP. These are hourly schedules broken out in 15-minute intervals. For these 2 hours, we have a load conformance imposed by operators into the HASP market for 2,600 megawatts. So the natural question is, if we put an additional load of 2,600 megawatts, how much of that drove additional transfers? How many more megawatts of transfers we get by imposing extra 2,600 megawatts of load into the system? Here is the answer, and this is the breakdown in terms of where each megawatt of the load conformance goes to. This is taking as a reference the original solution that is still contaminated with the overscheduling condition that we just explained. But it tells you, if we wouldn't have conformance in the system for that day, for that point in time, this is what the solution would look like. So it's the actual production that we had. And let's take just a case. Let's take any interval in one of the 2 hours, right? And let's say, for instance, interval 3 is quite representative. We are saying, because we impose an additional 26 megawatts of conformance into the HASP market, that conformance push supply in different ways. Out of the supply that I have available, in order to meet this extra 2,600 megawatts, I have to increase about 300 megawatts of imports. I will have a reduction of exports in the range of 1,000 megawatts. I'm going to be actually power balancing feasible by about 500 megawatts. I'm going to increase my internal CAISO generation by about 500 megawatts. And by the way, I'm going to get additional 200 or so megawatts of transfers. Having a 26 megawatts of conformance in the HASP market effectively is bringing about 200, 300 megawatts of additional transfers. And that is only that interval. If we go into hour ending 20, indeed, the additional procurement for the load conformance is actually resulting in a reduction of the transfers. Because now the solution is telling me it's more economical for me to cut way more exports. If I have a bias of 2,600 megawatts, I will cut 3,300 megawatts of exports, and because I don't need more supply, I can actually reduce my transfers. So indeed, in some cases, the bias is going to lead to lower transfers rather than increasing the transfers. The 13% that I mentioned here is for the full hour ending 19, just taking the total volume. So what is the takeaway of this? That it's not obvious that 26 megawatts of load conformance is going to result in 26 megawatts of transfers to indicate that it should be a straightforward put into the capacity test. And next slide, please. We have the same scenario, but we are trying to take away the noise introduced by overscheduling, because we know it was not an ideal outcome. It was what was in production at that time, but we are trying to look forward how this would play out when we don't have this issue of the overscheduling. The solution is not that different, and indeed you can see that once we do not allow overscheduling on the interties, the additional bias is going to largely result simply in cutting or reducing more exports in the system. And because you can afford that, now you rely less on the EIM transfers. That is the main conclusion on this slide. Next slide, please. And now we go into the same exercise, but we do that for the 15-minute market. And why we want to redo this for the 15-minute market? Because the 15-minute market is going to get the results that are utilized as inputs into the test. Once we clear the market, that solution is going to serve as the starting point for the flexible ramping test. When we do the same exercise and we want to identify where these 26 megawatts of load conformance come from, you can see the breakdown, and we can look into the binding interval only, the second interval, because this is a FMM run and only the second interval is binding. If we focus on this breakdown, you can see that out of the 2,600 megawatts of load conformance, about 600 are infeasibilities. We are infeasible by that much. We are going to reduce 15-minute F4 transactions by 260 megawatts. We are going to increase in the transfers. There is an increase in transfers of about 750 megawatts. And the rest, about 3,800%, is going to be by increasing internal generation that we have in our system. This is the breakdown of what it means to have a conformance in the 15-minute market. Next slide, please. The next slide is the same exercise, but taking away the noise of the overscheduling, meaning that we adjusted the penalty prices to ensure that there is no overscheduling. And the results are kind of along the same line. The additional conformance is going to result in more power balancing feasibility because now we don't rely on this artificial import supply. We are going to continue to have some reduction of exports. I think I forgot to update this to 60 megawatts. And we're going to increase transfers by basically 900 megawatts. Out of a load conformance of 2,600 megawatts, 900 of that becomes EIM import transfers. Now, what is the implication of having this outcome? Let's move to the next slide, please. Let's skip this one. Let's move one more, please. What is the implication of this? One theory that has been discussed in the initiative is that by the time you increase your load by having additional conformance, the consequence is that you're going to be making more space on your resources. That doesn't hold true all the time, and this stress case is a good reference for that. When we increase the load conformance in either HASP or FNM, we do increase our internal supply because we are limited in supply across the West, right? It's not just the CAISO. There is limited megawatts in the system. And if we have something in the CAISO, that generation is going to move up. So the implication of having load conformance into the CAISO system is going to imply that we're going to increase our generation. We're going to incrementally dispatch our internal resources. When we go into the implications of the flexible ramping test, there is only one implication that is straightforward, and that is the results of the FMM market are going to be used as the starting point to calculate the flexible ramping requirements into the hour that we are going to be testing. In this graph, what you can see is that this blue dot is the starting point, that is the scheduling dispatch of that given resource, and based on the ramping capability, we calculate how far it can go in 15 minutes. That means into the first interval of the hour being tested. And at some point, it's going to reach the upper economic limit and cannot go beyond that because that is the maximum limit it can hit. Next slide, please. When we add the load conformance to the system, what is going to happen? That starting point, that blue dot, is going to go up because we increase the generation of our internal resources. By virtue of increasing the starting point, all what we are doing is eating into the flexibility that is going to be available for the test. So having 800 megawatts of increase of internal generation because of load bias effectively means we lose that much 800 megawatts into the flexible ramping test, because now it's capacity that is not available because we're starting in a higher point. That factors in directly the implication of having the load conformance already in the flexible ramping test, and it's already deducting the flexibility that we get deprived by using the load conformance. It's not a one-to-one relationship. 2,600 megawatts of conformance results in 800 megawatts of internal generation. These are 800 megawatts that are no longer available as flexible capacity into the test. Next slide, please. Just to close the discussion on this, and this is coming back to Michelle's question. If we focus back on the summer of 2021. July 9 was a critical day. And on this day, you can see here the breakdown of all the exports that we have cleared eventually in the real-time market. And they can be coming from existing transmission rights, from wheels, from day ahead, scale from day ahead coming into the real-time, or just last-minute real-time exports that can be low-priority exports or economic exports. And that is the portion in gray. Next slide. When we compare the volume of the EIM transfer imports that we got into the system based on RTD versus the level of exports that we clear in the real time, and only focus just on the subset of real-time exports, meaning last-minute real-time self-schedule exports or economic exports, you get this overlapping condition. And what you can see is that at least for the critical hours, the peak hours of these 3 days, the amount of exports, real-time, last-minute exports that we cleared in the real-time market were in excess of the import transfers that we were getting from somewhere else. Effectively means the EIM import transfers were partially, or in some cases even totally supporting the exports that eventually got cleared in the real-time market. I don't want to make a correlation for 1, 2, 3 days to be a general extension of what happens all the time, but that just tells you that there are many dynamics in the market. So if we really want to talk about the implications of EIM transfers, we need to look this more holistically, including the implications of real-time exports. Real-time exports are hourly schedules. They get secured in the hourly process. The real-time import transfers are going to be dynamically assessed on 5-minute basis. It's more granular, more targeted. But the numbers are the volumes of exports cleared way exceeded the volumes of imports cleared in the market. And I have 1 minute left to see if we can address at least one question, Ben.
Okay.
All right, and we do have a comment on the line. Sorry, go ahead. Ben, did you want to make a comment first?
No, let's go right to the questions, which have 30 seconds apiece.
All right, Dan, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. I know we've got another meeting starting in 1 minute, so I guess just I'll ask. I feel like I've gotten lost here on where HASP is scheduling hourly block imports. On this last slide, we talk about kind of hourly block exports, but I kind of lost in this whole discussion what's going on with that economic intertie supply relative to the market choosing those and getting those schedules in for the hour versus maybe seeing a bunch of available EIM imports and scheduling those instead of the hourly blocks. And maybe that's something we can follow up in a future meeting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, if you're going to follow up.
I do see another comment. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let's go to the other comment.
All right, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Guillermo. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Thanks for sharing all this data. I'll just make a really quick point given the time, which is, you characterize some of the EIM transfers during these periods as economic displacement. But if you look at slide 29 is a good example. You have data that's showing the CAISO is simultaneously receiving large volumes of EIM imports, cutting non-EIM exports, and even after that, facing power balance violations. And so it just seems like some of the data is indicating that, it's not that the CAISO is displacing a higher cost resource, but that the EIM imports are actually coming in and being needed to meet load and needed to avoid an even larger power balance violation. So I just was looking for some feedback to hear what your thoughts were about that, because it seemed like that's what the data is showing.
Yeah. I wish we could have more time for this conversation, Jeff. I think we just really ran out of time. I think there could be other opportunity we can go deeper into this. For now, I think we just have to cut it short.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry about the time. I should have trimmed everybody's lunch. So thank you very much for joining us at today's MSC meeting. Thanks to James and Guillermo for the presentations and to everybody for the discussions. And we look forward to our next meeting. Everybody have a good weekend and a great Thanksgiving holiday. Adam, we can end the call here.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar. Thank you for using Event Services, and you may now disconnect.